Lena Mitchell had always been the kind of person who appeared to have everything together. She had a successful career in marketing, a beautiful house in the suburbs, and a family that seemed to be the epitome of happiness. Her husband, Tom, was a well-regarded businessman, known for his charm and success. To anyone who looked at them from the outside, they were the perfect couple. They had been married for 7 years, and in that time, Lena had built a life that many would envy. But behind closed doors, things were far from perfect. Tom was different when no one else was around. At first, it was subtle. Small comments that undermined her confidence or made her feel inadequate. He would criticize her choices, her appearance, and even her friends. Over time, these comments became more frequent, more cutting. What began as a simple remark about a meal or a casual joke about her clothes escalated into something darker. Tom controlled everything. He controlled their finances, their social life, even the way Lena spent her free time. Lena's friends started noticing that she seemed more distant, more withdrawn. Her once confident, outgoing personality was slowly being chipped away. But it wasn't just the emotional control that had Lena feeling trapped. There were the late nights, when Tom would come home after drinking too much, his mood unpredictable. He would pick fights over nothing at all, accusing Lena of being inattentive or disloyal. The physical confrontations were rare, but they had happened enough for Lena to know that Tom could be dangerous when he was angry. There was no escaping the feeling that, over time, she had become nothing more than a shadow of her former self. Her friends tried to intervene, expressing concern, but Lena always dismissed their worries. She didn't want to believe that the man she had married could be anything other than the man she once loved. She convinced herself that Tom's behavior was just a phase, that things would get better. He would apologize after each fight, shower her with gifts and affection, making her feel like everything was okay again. But deep down, Lena knew something wasn't right. One particular evening stands out in Lena's mind as the moment when everything changed. It was a quiet Saturday night, and she had just returned from grocery shopping. She walked into the house to find Tom sitting in the living room, a bottle of wine in hand. His face was flushed and his eyes were vacant. He barely looked at her as she entered. "Where have you been?" he asked, his voice low and threatening. Lena's heart sank. It wasn't the first time he had questioned her like this, but the intensity of his gaze made her feel small and insignificant. "I was just getting groceries," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. Tom stood up abruptly, knocking over the wine glass. "You're always out. You think I don't know what you're up to?" His voice had a venomous edge to it, and Lena immediately felt the tension in the air. Fear gnawed at her as she realized that the man she had married, the man she thought she knew, had become a stranger to her. That night, Tom didn't lay a hand on her, but the emotional abuse was worse than ever. His words cut deeper than any slap could have, and Lena felt a heavy weight settle in her chest. Lena knew she couldn't keep living like this. She had tried to ignore the signs, tried to convince herself that things would improve, but now, standing in that cold, dark room, she realized that her marriage was a prison. She was suffocating, but even then she wasn't ready to face the reality of what that meant. She didn't know how to escape. How could she leave the man she had once loved, the man who seemed so perfect to everyone else? For the first time in a long while, Lena felt something stir inside her. Fear, yes, but also a flicker of defiance. Deep down, she knew she had to get out. The question was, how? Lena's decision to leave wasn't easy. In fact, it felt almost impossible. She had spent years convincing herself that things would get better, that Tom's behavior was a temporary phase. or that she somehow deserved it. But that night, after everything had unfolded, something inside her shifted. It was a quiet realization, a whisper in the back of her mind. I can't live like this anymore. The first step was simple, yet terrifying. She had to start making plans. Lena had always been the practical type, so when she decided she would escape, she began by setting aside small amounts of money. Tom had always controlled their finances, managing their bank accounts and credit cards with an iron grip. Lena had no access to funds without his approval, and her small salary as a marketing assistant barely left her with enough to pay for essentials, let alone stash away money for the future. But she was resourceful. Lena started hiding cash whenever she could, tucking it into envelopes she kept hidden in the back of her closet. It was a slow process, but she knew that every dollar counted. It wasn't just money that Lena had to worry about. Tom had been so controlling over the years that he knew everything about her life, her friends, her schedule, even the apps on her phone. He'd installed tracking software on her devices under the guise of safety, which meant Lena couldn't make a move without his knowing. She needed to be smart, to work in the shadows without drawing attention. That meant going offline, erasing traces of her plans from every device, and using burner phones to communicate with her friends. She contacted an old friend, Emma, who had moved to a different city years ago. Emma had always been the supportive type, the one who had encouraged Lena to be more independent. When Lena finally admitted the extent of her situation, Emma didn't hesitate. She told Lena that she had a place to stay, an apartment in a quiet part of the city, far from Tom's reach. Lena felt a glimmer of hope as she listened to Emma's reassuring voice, but she also felt the weight of the danger. The moment Tom found out she was leaving, he would retaliate. Lena didn't know how far he would go, but she couldn't afford to wait and find out. She had to act now before it was too late. The next hurdle was finding a job. She couldn't rely on Tom for any kind of financial support anymore. She needed something steady, something that would give her independence. It wasn't easy. Most of her career had been spent supporting Tom's business connections, and she had no current references or experience beyond that. But Lena knew she had the skills. She updated her resume, starting with the marketing work she'd done for Tom's company, even though he had been the one who'd taken credit for it. Lena was good at her job, better than Tom ever realized. She started applying to companies, sending out dozens of emails a day. She did all of this while pretending that everything at home was normal. Tom had grown complacent in his control, not suspecting that Lena was preparing for something he couldn't stop. Every day, she faced the difficult task of appearing as if nothing had changed. On the surface, life continued. She cooked his meals, cleaned the house, and went about her usual routines. But behind those routines, Lena was a woman on a mission. But there were moments when doubt crept in. What if Tom found out? What if everything fell apart before she could get out? She had to keep her fears locked away deep inside. If she hesitated for even a second, Tom would see it, and everything she had planned would unravel. Her nights were sleepless, spent wide-eyed and anxious, worrying that the man she had once loved would soon become her worst enemy. As the weeks passed, Lena slowly saw the fruits of her labor. She found a new job. Not as glamorous as her previous position, but it was enough to get by. The apartment Emma had offered her was ready, and she had managed to save enough money to make the first few months of her escape possible. She had a plan, but there was still one thing left to do: get out without Tom knowing. If she was careful, If she stayed one step ahead, she could do it. But the closer the moment came, the more Lena felt the weight of the choice she was about to make. There was no going back now. She had to leave, or risk losing herself completely. The day Lena finally made the decision to leave felt so real. It was early morning, the sun barely peeking through the curtains, and Tom was still fast asleep in their bedroom. For a moment, Lena stood there, staring at him, watching the rise and fall of his chest, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. She had spent years loving him, believing in their marriage, and now, in this quiet moment, she was about to break free from it all. But there was no turning back. The fear in her heart was overwhelming, but the sense of relief was even stronger. Lena had packed her things the night before, stuffing a small suitcase with clothes and personal items, anything she could carry without raising suspicion. She kept her essentials hidden in a bag under the bed, planning to take it with her as soon as she left the house. The hardest part wasn't leaving. It was the uncertainty. She had no idea what Tom would do once he realized she was gone. He was unpredictable, capable of lashing out in ways she couldn't anticipate. She moved quietly around the house, checking the rooms to make sure everything was as it should be. The house felt cold, empty, and the walls seemed to press in on her as she tiptoed through the hall. Every creak of the floorboard, every sound seemed to echo in the stillness. She wasn't sure why she felt the need to be so cautious. She knew Tom was a heavy sleeper, but old habits die hard. For so long, Lena had been tiptoeing around his moods, avoiding conflict, staying under the radar. It was second nature to her now. Before she could change her mind, Lena grabbed her phone and sent a quick message to Emma telling her she was leaving and that she would be on her way soon. The message was simple, but it held a weight that was hard to describe. It was the final step, the point of no return. She took one last look at the house, the place that had once been a home but had now become a prison. With one deep breath, she stepped outside. The cool air hit her face as she walked toward her car. She had already planned the route she would take, carefully choosing roads she knew Tom wouldn't think to check. Her car was parked down the street, out of sight, and she had even left the garage door closed, making it look as if she had never left. She started the engine and drove away, her heart pounding in her chest, but also filled with a strange sense of exhilaration. For the first time in years, she felt like she had control over her own life again. But as she drove, the fear crept in again. What if Tom realized she was gone? What if he was already awake and looking for her? The possibility of him chasing her, of him finding her, made Lena's hands shake on the steering wheel. She couldn't think about that right now. She couldn't afford to let fear dictate her every move. She had worked too hard to get here. Lena's mind raced as she made her way to Emma's apartment. The city felt like a blur as she passed through unfamiliar streets, but everything seemed distant, disconnected from the life she had left behind. The weight of her decision didn't hit her until she turned the corner and saw the building where Emma lived. It was small, tucked away in a quiet part of town, far from the busy streets she was used to. It was perfect. This was the place where Lena could start over, where she could finally be free. She parked the car and took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. She grabbed the bag from the passenger seat and walked up to the door, her heart still racing, but also filled with a sense of accomplishment. She had done it. She had left. No matter what happened next, she was no longer a prisoner in her own home. She rang the doorbell, and when Emma opened it, the look of relief on her friend's face was enough to reassure Lena that she had made the right choice. But even as she stepped into the safety of Emma's apartment, a nagging feeling settled in her gut. It wasn't over yet. She knew Tom would come looking for her, that he wouldn't give up without a fight. But for the first time in years, Lena felt a flicker of hope. She was free, at least for now, and that was enough to give her the strength to face whatever came next. Lena tried to settle into her new life as best as she could, but the unease never fully left her. Each day felt like a constant balancing act. One moment she would feel a sense of relief, as though the worst was over, and the next, she'd be consumed with fear that Tom was just around the corner. She had left everything behind: the home, the friends, the life they had built together. But what was waiting for her in this new life? She didn't know. And that uncertainty weighed heavily on her. The first few days in Emma's apartment were a blur. Lena had no time to relax. She threw herself into her new job, trying to distract herself from the nagging worry. Emma was understanding, offering support whenever Lena needed it, but Lena didn't want to burden her friend too much. After all, Emma had a life of her own, and Lena didn't want to impose. She tried to act normal, to rebuild herself piece by piece, but the fear of Tom's reaction was always lurking in the back of her mind. She kept her phone close, expecting calls or messages from Tom. He had always been controlling, and now that he knew she had left, he would do everything in his power to bring her back. Lena knew that. She had no doubt that he would stop at nothing to find her. She had changed her number the moment she left, but part of her still worried that he would figure out a way to contact her. She made sure to check her phone constantly, her heart skipping a beat every time it buzzed. It wasn't long before Lena started noticing things. Small things at first. She'd come home from work to find a strange voicemail on her phone, just static, and a few garbled words that didn't make sense. A letter addressed to her, with no return address, was slipped under the door of Emma's apartment. It was postmarked from their old town, but there was no message inside. Nothing but a photo of their old house. A chill ran down her spine. How had Tom found her so quickly? She had taken every precaution to stay hidden. It seemed impossible that he could have tracked her down so soon. The paranoia started to take over. Lena found herself checking over her shoulder as she walked down the street, looking over her shoulder whenever she entered or left the apartment. She knew she had to be careful, but she couldn't help but feel exposed. She began staying home more, avoiding unnecessary trips outside. She knew she couldn't live like this forever, but the constant anxiety was wearing her down. Then, one evening, things took a terrifying turn. Lena had just returned from work, exhausted but relieved to be home. As she unlocked the door to Emma's apartment, she froze. A black van was parked across the street, its engine idling in the quiet evening air. She couldn't be sure, but something about the vehicle seemed off. It didn't belong there, not in this quiet neighborhood. For a moment she stood perfectly still, her heart racing. She was sure it was him. Tom had found her. He had come for her. She hurried inside and locked the door behind her, but the feeling of dread didn't go away. The van stayed there for hours, unmoving, as if it were waiting for her to make a mistake. Lena couldn't sleep that night. She stayed awake, staring out the window, watching the van. It was as though her every fear was coming true. Tom was out there somewhere looking for her. But the next morning when she went outside, the van was gone. It could have been nothing, just some coincidence. But Lena couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. The fear had taken hold of her completely. She couldn't escape it, no matter where she went or how hard she tried. She reached out to the authorities, filing a report about the unsettling experiences, but the police, while sympathetic, told her there was little they could do without evidence of direct threats. It was frustrating, and Lena was left feeling helpless. Her once quiet life had been turned upside down. She was no longer the person she had been just a few months ago. Tom's presence, his obsession, had infiltrated every part of her new life. The more Lena tried to escape, the more she realized that Tom's hold on her was far from over. The sense of fear grew more intense each day, and it began to feel as though she would never truly be free. But Lena wasn't the same woman she had been when she left. She had come too far to turn back now. Even as Tom's shadow seemed to loom over her every move, Lena was determined to face whatever came next. She couldn't let him control her life any longer, no matter how far he went to find her. Days turned into weeks, and Lena's sense of dread only deepened. The van had disappeared, but it left a lingering fear that seemed to take root in every corner of her life. She had no way of knowing if Tom was really out there, watching her, or if her mind was simply playing tricks on her. But the constant feeling of being followed, of being hunted, gnawed at her every moment. Every phone call, every knock on the door, every shadow in the corner of her eye made her jump. She was no longer just afraid for her safety, she was terrified that she might lose everything again. But, despite the mounting fear, something inside her had shifted. The Lena who had left everything behind was no longer the same woman. She had changed, become stronger in ways she hadn't realized. Her fear didn't stop her from pushing forward, it fueled her determination. She had to stay one step ahead of Tom, no matter what. She couldn't go back to that life. She wouldn't let him win. It was early one evening when the phone call came. Lena's heart stopped when she saw the unfamiliar number flashing on her screen. She hesitated before picking up, a familiar dread creeping into her chest. She knew this could be the call that confirmed her worst fear. It could be Tom. Or worse, someone looking for him. But when she answered, the voice on the other end wasn't what she expected. "Hello, Lena. It's Detective Miller. I've been investigating your case, and I think we need to talk." Lena's breath caught in her throat. Detective Miller. She had reached out to the police weeks ago after the van incident, but hadn't heard much since. She hadn't expected them to take her seriously, not with so little evidence to go on. But now, hearing his voice, she knew something was changing. Something was happening. Detective Miller's tone was calm but urgent. "We've been tracking Tom. We've got a lead, and we think he might be planning something big. I know you've been living in fear, and we want to help. But we need you to come in for a meeting." Lena's mind raced. Was this the break she had been waiting for? Could she really trust the authorities to protect her from someone like Tom? She had no idea what Tom was capable of now, what he might do if he realized the police were involved. But she knew one thing. She couldn't continue living in hiding. She couldn't go on like this, looking over her shoulder every second of the day. After a few moments of silence, Lena finally spoke, her voice trembling. "What do you need me to do?" Detective Miller reassured her that they would take every precaution to keep her safe, but they needed to act quickly. Lena agreed to meet him, her mind spinning with the possibilities of what this meeting could mean. Could the authorities finally offer the protection she needed? Could this be the end of her nightmare? The meeting took place the next morning. Detective Miller briefed Lena on the investigation, explaining that they had traced Tom's movements over the past few weeks. They had been able to gather enough evidence to show that Tom was more dangerous than she had ever imagined. It seemed that he was planning something big. Something that involved Lena, and the detective wasn't sure whether it was going to be a final confrontation or something worse. But one thing was clear, he wasn't going to let her slip away quietly. Tom had gone too far, and now Lena's escape had triggered something in him that could be dangerous for everyone involved. Lena listened carefully, her thoughts racing as she processed the information. The detective was right. Tom wouldn't stop. He would come after her, and he would come hard. But now she wasn't alone. For the first time in months, Lena felt a flicker of hope. The police were taking her seriously, and they were prepared to protect her. She wouldn't have to face this battle alone. The detective made a plan to have officers stationed around the apartment complex, ensuring that Lena would have a safety net in place. They would monitor Tom's movements and intercept him before he could make any dangerous moves. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was something. For the first time in months, Lena felt a sense of control return to her life. That night, As she lay in bed, Lena realized that she had finally taken the power back. The road ahead would be uncertain, and the danger was far from over, but she no longer felt powerless. She wasn't just running anymore. She was fighting for her life, for her freedom, and she had a team of people who were willing to stand by her. In that moment, Lena made a promise to herself she would no longer be defined by fear. She would survive this. No matter what it took, she would escape Tom's hold, and she would start over again, this time stronger than ever.